and welcome to episode 1 of the Northern Saga History Podcast. Today we'll be discussing the history of the Russian Vikings. I'm Alexander.
And I'm Philip. And before we discuss the topic at hand, we would first like to issue a small disclaimer. We are by no means professional historians. We're a couple of students doing this for fun, and we strongly encourage you to read up on the topic in the links provided in the description.
Now, who were the Russian Vikings? You might say, Vikings? That doesn't sound very Russian. Well, this is a topic that isn't very well known for a number of reasons, particularly about the fact that there's very little information available about the period. Therefore, many very different views have been made about the subjects in the past. For instance, in the Russian Empire and later in the Soviet Union, which has done most of Russian history up to now, they practiced anti-Normanist views about the time period. These views said that the Slavs sort of figured out the entire civilization on their own without any real intervention from the Vikings. Philip, maybe you'd like to say something about why the Soviets didn't really like the idea of the Vikings involving in Slavic affairs.
Yeah, sure. As the resident Soviet boo, I can maybe have a couple of words about this. The entire, concept stems from, or not concept, but this idea of
Normanicism.
Yeah, anti-Normanicism. It stems from the fact that the Germans tried to invade the Soviet Union and take over it, during the Second World War, I'm sure you remember. But, and as a result, since the Germans are obviously, they're, the Vikings, they're obviously, a Germanic people, right?
Yes.
And especially Norway and Sweden and such, and Denmark. And the Germans are also Germanic, obviously.
Yeah.
This whole idea that the Germans, people who are trying to invade and take over the Soviet Union, were actually, had actually an effect on the development of the Soviet Union and by extension, the Russian Empire, it wasn't exactly good for Soviet
propaganda. It didn't really sit well.
No, exactly. And as such, the Soviets, they were also very keen on motivating the Soviet people, which, was in large part Slavic,
yeah.
but also Turkmen and Uzbek and, Central Asian. And as a result, this idea that Germanic industriousness really helped prop top the country, it didn't really side well with Soviet propaganda and the Soviet narrative in that period. So as a result, they, as the Soviets have a tendency to do, or had a tendency to do, they repressed much of the information that was available because it didn't align with them.
And this is one of the few areas where the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union actually agreed.
Right.
Because the Russian Empire practiced Slavophile views, which prioritized the industriousness and the prosperity of the Slavic people over all else. So, up to very recently, these views were the status quo, while recently historians have mostly disproven the theory that the Norse did not play a role in the early development of the Slavic people through archaeological evidence. Now, I said there was very few sources available at the time, but there is in fact a complete account of the rule of the Norse rulers all the way from Rurik, the original Norse settler who created the Rurikiid dynasty, to much later. This is called the Russian Primary Chronicle, written allegedly by a monk called Nestor, but as one might imagine, he wasn't alone. Now, the Rurikiid rulers were in power at the time this was written, so most consider this to be a propaganda piece. As you might imagine, they wanted to make themselves look good and give themselves a good position in society. So, the Russian Primary Chronicle isn't really considered to be a reliable source, and there have been found lots of incongruities, especially with dates and events that you can't find them in other sources. This is also due to the fact there are very few sources available.
Yeah, but this primary chronicle, was it written by Rurik or was it written by a historian or
Nestor, he was a monk, right? Christian monk.
Right.
It was written around the year 1113, so well after Rurik's time, but still in the time of the Rurikids.
Right.
Thankfully, we have been able to confirm some parts of the primary chronicle with Byzantine sources, because the Byzantines were very meticulous when writing records, letters, whatever, and very, factual, very easy to understand. So we know that parts of the primary chronicle, particularly the chronology of the rulers and many of the major events, can actually be trusted. There's also been found archaeological evidence. For instance, in the north of Russia, they've been found lots of Norse settlements, previous Norse settlements, obviously, and lots of Norse relics. And in the south of Russia, they found lots of evidence coinciding to the Christianization of the Norse, who would become known as the Roose.
Wait, so, remind me again, when did the Norse get Christianized?
Well, this was with Vladimir the Great, which I'm going to get to later. But this was due to an emissary from the Byzantine Empire. They went through this whole story, which I'm going to tell, about how they're deciding their religion until they eventually decided upon Christianity. But to understand what led to this, we need to go all the way back to Rurik. Now, in the primary chronicle, there's a very fancy story about this happened, which honestly is probably completely made up, but it's still pretty fun. So, around the year 862, the Slavic people, who nowadays, you know them as Russian, Ukrainians, and Belarusian, but back in those days, there was 1 trillion tribes, each of them with their own culture, language, and customs, didn't really get along that well with each other. Yeah. So, but because they were so spread out and divided, they couldn't defend themselves from outside forces attempting to exile tribute, particularly the Jewish Khazars, and according to the primary chronicle, the Varangians, which is a Greek and Slavic name for the Vikings, who weren't really Vikings, but more traders in the area, but we'll get to that later. Now, so the story says that these Varangians would exact tribute from the Slavic tribes in the what is today northern Russia. But the Slavic tribes had enough of this, so they drove them out. Now, they all left, and the Slavic tribes were like, well, what do we do now? They got no law, they got no order, they're all really divided. So then they go back to the Varangians, and they're like, hey, guys, you wanna set up a whole ruling system? We need someone to create laws and make sure that we don't kill each other all the time. So, they invited a group of Swedish Vikings known as the Russes. You can see where the name Roose comes from.
Right. The Kievan Roose.
Yeah. Which was the name of the civilization, which most people associate with the Slavs, but the name originally came from the Norse. At least that's what modern historians have agreed upon. Now, leader of the Rooses was Rurik and his brothers Cineas and Truvor, but we forget those guys because literally every big hero has brothers that help him, but everyone forgets them.
Right.
Now, Rurik, he brings his entire clan, which at that time would be his entire extended family. So, not nowadays we would think grandpa, grandmother, but back in those days it was like your violent cousin who's going to help you sack the neighboring tribe.
Right.
Yeah.
As you do.
So, but he wasn't the only Varangian. 2 others who may or may not have been related to Rurik, we are pretty sure they weren't of his family, might have been related to Ragnar Lothbrok, to Varangians Askold and Dir, set up in Kiev. Now, we're going to get back to those later. They're very important.
Okay.
Same time, Rurik and his gang set up shop in the north of Russia, what is today Russia. They built some pretty impressive settlements, particularly the city which they called Holmgarder, which today is known as Novgorod, which became the center of the area. Until, of course, they built St. Petersburg and Arkhangelsk, but we'll get... That's not in this time period.
Yeah, I think St. Petersburg is... a little out of this time period.
Yeah, a little
bit. A couple of centuries.
Rurik never actually ruled over Kiev because he was busy building settlements and building a civilization in the north of Russia. And we have all sorts of interesting relics archaeologically found from the Vikings, particularly around the area of Ladoga, which is a historical settlement. Now, at the same time as they're doing the very un-Viking thing of building settlements and trading, Askold and Dir, they decide, well, we're bored. And south of us, there's this enormous city, which is apparently full of gold and stuff.
Right.
And they're like, well, what do you do if you're a Viking and you see an enormous city full of gold and stuff?
You pillage it, of course.
Obviously, you pillage it.
Yeah.
So Askold and Dir, they get their gang and they go on what was the first Roose attack on Constantinople. Now, you see, the Byzantine Emperor didn't really expect that because he thought that area was just ruled by the Jewish Khazars Khaganate. So he was busy down in, what is today Turkey, down in Arabia, fighting the Abbasid caliphs. So, while he was there busy with the Byzantine army and fleet, the Roose went on a little party down in Constantinople.
Right.
This is one of the few events that we know for certain happened, because we have evidence from the Byzantines. Particularly, we have this one patriarch who was holding a sermon, who explicitly stated, "God save us from these Roose barbarians who are pillaging our city." Now, so Askell and Dare get their nice share of gold. They're pretty happy, and they go back to Kiev and make it pretty prosperous with all this loot, and also make it into a major trading center. And they rule peacefully, like Vikings are very known for doing.
Right.
Now, as you probably noticed, you have two competing factions springing up in the area which is now Russia. You have Askell and Dare in Kiev, and then you have Rurik and his gang up in Novgorod. So what happens is, Rurik dies.
Yeah.
RIP. We don't really know what Rurik did except build those settlements. He's a very legendary figure.
Right.
So he dies, but he's got a small problem. His son, who Slavic name known as Igor, but Norse name known as Ingvar. I'll be using the Slavic names for simplicity, but most of the rulers had a corresponding Norse name, which is most likely the one they used.
Right.
So Igor, he was pretty young. So Rurik tells his clansman, his cousin or whatever, who's called Oleg or Helgi in Norse name, and tells him, "Yo, dog, can you go look after my son?" And he's like, "Sure. Do I get a rule over Kiev while he grows up?" And Rurik is like, "Sure. No, not Kiev. Sorry, Novgorod."
Right.
So Oleg is like, "Well, I gotta sit and wait for Rurik's son to grow up, and I've got nothing to do." So what do Vikings do when they've got nothing to do, Philip?
They loot and pillage.
They loot and pillage. So he goes south and conquers. But he notices one thing, and that is that Askell and Dare have a lot more soldiers than him.
Right.
So what do Vikings do when their enemy has a lot more soldiers than them?
I mean, I would retreat, but knowing the Vikings, they'd probably, I don't know, charge right in.
Yeah, because Askell and Dare didn't really know that Oleg was their enemy.
Yep.
So he and a small group of soldiers were invited into Kiev on a diplomatic mission. You can't see it, but I'm doing goose eyes here.
Right.
And then immediately Oleg/Helgi brutally slaughters Askell and Dare and conquers Kiev. And this is technically when the Kievan Rus begins. Because this is when the North and South were united, and Oleg named Kiev the capital, because he thought it was a pretty cool city and was a very important trading center. Gotta remember, back then, the East Slavic people were not agricultural people, they relied on trade. They would trade furs, beeswax, honey, timber, grain, and there was this huge trade route going all the way from the north of Russia to Constantinople, to Arabia, to Europe. And that made Kiev in the center of it all, and also Constantinople an important focal point. Now, Oleg, he's got this fancy new city, right? And he says, wow, there was a lot of stuff here in Kiev, and some of it came from this place called Constantinople. So, what do Vikings do when they hear of a place that apparently got loot?
They loot and pillage.
They loot and pillage, as we have previously established. So, Oleg, this event, although it's written about in the primary chronicle, we aren't really sure if he actually got to Constantinople, because the Byzantines don't have any records on it. They only have the records of the treaty that followed it. But Oleg takes his gang, and they go down to Constantinople, and he's greeted by a Byzantine envoy who offers him a drink to create a truce, peace between them. Of course, he, being the smart guy he is, realizes that they poisoned the drink and probably brutally murders the envoys.
Right.
Now, he's got a small problem, you see. He wants to attack the Byzantine walls, which are on land, because cannons haven't been invented yet, you see?
Yeah.
But most of his strength is in his boats. So what do you do when you need to get the strength of your boats on land? You put wheels on the boats.
Right.
Yes.
I would never have thought of that, but that is a solution, yes.
Yes. So Oleg decides to do the very smart thing, and he puts the wheels on his boats and sails towards the walls. Well, sails is a bit of a not the correct term, but wheels
drives them, drives the
drives.
boat. Yeah.
And the Byzantines are like, what is going on? Has our god abandoned us? Why are these boats coming towards us?
What a sight! I mean, just boats on wheels.
Yeah, and there's full of angry Norsemen and Slavs.
Well, so they were in the boats.
Yeah,
Well,
probably pushing them though.
oh, okay. It's not like they were in the boats and someone else pushed. Oh, okay.
It's a legendary story. It doesn't delve into the
well, like,
details.
what's the point of this? I don't get it. Like,
I mean, honestly, I don't know, but it's an interesting story.
okay, sure.
It was a way to assault the walls, I suppose, and maybe it made it easier to carry all that loot back to the sea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Viking ingenuity.
But I mean, knowing the Vikings, they could have just taken some slaves. But
Yeah, but they had plenty of slaves going around. Like, you
Yeah.
know, the name Slav comes from the word slave because they were
Does it?
yeah, they were actually one of the most enslaved peoples back in the ancient era.
oh,
Yeah, so because they couldn't really defend themselves, right?
Okay. Oh.
But you know, they proved everyone wrong by becoming a superpower.
Right.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But so all this results in Oleg making a treaty with the Byzantines. This is the first or second. They might have made a treaty with Ascald and Deir. No, they didn't. Sorry,
Okay.
think of something else. But they made a treaty which gave Roose very favorable trading rights, which was actually probably a lot more valuable than all the loot they stole from Constantinople, because, you know, trade makes the world goes around.
Yeah.
Now, the last thing we know about Oleg is, for one thing, he befriended the Drevlians. Now, this is going to be important later, because, as I mentioned, there are lots of different tribes of Slavs. The main one in the north being the Ilmens, but you also have the Drevlians, who didn't really like this whole Norse ruler thing, so it was important that Oleg befriended them. Now, there is this story told in the primary chronicle about his death. So, Oleg, he talks to a seer, and he says, how am I going to die? Because everyone wants to know how they're going to die. So, the seer tells him that your horse is going to kill you, or your horse is going to be the reason you die.
Okay.
So, Oleg is very smart, does as you would do, and keeps the horse in the stable far away, right?
Yeah.
And one day he hears that his horse is dead, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do with a dead horse?
You bury it? I don't know.
Well, I was going to make a joke about beating a dead horse.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, I'm too stupid. It's like early in the morning. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
So he goes to his horse, and he's basically gloating and saying, I am cheated faith. I am immortal.
Right.
And then a snake jumps up from the horse, bites him, and he dies.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds really like mythical.
Yeah, it's
That does not sound. No.
You see, the primary chronicle, it bases a lot of the Bible also, because it
Really?
uses Bible as if it was hard historical facts, because
Yeah,
back
okay.
then
Yeah.
they didn't differentiate. So it starts with the entire Tower of Babel and the Slavic people coming out of that.
Right.
So Oleg is dead.
Yeah.
But at this point, Rurik's son, Igor, or Ingvar, has grown up. Now, what do you do when you're a Viking prince and you've grown up and you don't have anything for your name, and you know your daddy was pretty legendary?
You loot and pillage.
You loot and pillage.
Yeah, of course.
So-
This is like the fourth time we've said this, but
This is
Vikings do loot and pillage.
Yeah, you can see a sort of trend here.
Yeah.
So he decides, I'm gonna attack Constantinople, and apparently, according to the Chronicle, he did that twice, and they resulted in favorable treaties, which is recorded by the treaty. Just like the last one, we have on record from the Byzantines, so we know that happened. We don't know that he got to Constantinople. So he had a party time as usual in Constantinople, created the treaties. Like, basically all do this at this point. And he started expanding the Kievan Rus state down near the Caspian Sea.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that was previously this year had been dominated by Turkic nomads, right?
Yeah.
But it was full of interesting resources coming from probably Persia and India, which they could use for their trade. So, yeah, and this also threatened the Jewish Khazars, which were a Khaganate, as I mentioned earlier. And this was the beginning of the downfall of the Jewish Khazars and the emergence of the Kievan Rus.
Yeah.
Now, Igor, he doesn't really do much interesting in the Chronicle, and he gets old, but he's pretty greedy. So he goes to the Drevlian and he exacts tribute.
Okay.
Now, what is tribute? What do you think about when you hear the word tribute?
I mean, tribute to something. I mean, in this context, it'd probably mean that they would have to pay him.
Yeah, because tribute is like taxation, right? But in taxation, it's very organized, very defined. But tribute is just, I'm stronger than you, now give me your wealth.
Right on, yeah.
Right, and this was the way the Kievan Roose society worked. Because you have a very small ruling class, enormous lands with tons of different people, you can't have an organized taxation system.
Yeah.
So instead, they exact tribute the same way as the nomads and the cognates did. Which meant that for the Slavs, it didn't really matter who ruled them. They still paid tribute. This is important for seeing why they didn't get that much Norse influence, because they just paid up. They didn't really care. Now, Igor, he's got this tribute from the Drevlians, the ones we mentioned earlier. And he's like, you know what would be nice? A bit more tribute.
Yeah.
So he goes back to the Drevlians and decides to ask for tribute again. Well, ask is probably not the word he used, probably demand.
Yeah.
So, what do you do when you're an angry Slavic tribe who dislikes the Norse rulers and they try to enact tribute from you twice?
Well, you revolt.
Yeah. So, the Drevlians, they decide to kill Igor's guards.
Yeah.
And then they tied his legs between two trees or something to that effect.
Igor's.
Yeah, Igor's.
Oh.
While they held down the trees. And they tied him to each tree.
Okay.
And then they loosened the trees, so his body was torn apart.
Oh.
Yeah, it's nice times.
Yeah, but very PG.
Yeah, but it's like a story about why greed doesn't pay, you know? His greed was his downfall.
Fair enough, but, I mean... Yeah, sure, whatever, yeah, okay.
Now, Igor, he had a wife who was a Slav, as far as we know. Mm-hmm. Might have been descendant of some Slavic ruler of Pskov.
Yeah.
And she was called Olga. And she was a pretty strong, independent woman. And when she sees that her husbands get torn apart by trees, by this Slavic tribe, she doesn't take that very lightly.
Yeah.
But she does see that the Drevlians, they're strong. She's weak. She's a female leader, right? At this point, she's a female regent. Until Igor's son Sviatoslav can become ruler.
Yep.
And back in those days, women rulers didn't really have that many rights or weren't respected that much. So she had to be a bit smart about the whole revenge thing. Mm-hmm. So to start with, she tells the Drevlians, "Oh, I'm so impressed that you killed my husband. I would like to marry your leader. Please send a diplomatic envoys."
Yeah.
So the Drevlians, underestimating the female guys, decide to send a group of envoys. And they come in a boat to Kiev, and she tells them, "You don't have to get out of your boat. We will carry you because we have such great respect for you." So her soldiers, they start carrying the Drevlians, and they start noticing there's this huge pit in front of them, and they're like, "Hold on. Something doesn't add up here." So, and then the soldiers immediately dump the Drevlian envoys into the pit and bury them alive.
Oh, how nice.
And you see, this is just the beginning. She's a pretty angry woman.
Yeah.
So she says, "Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed," because this is back in the early Middle Ages. Like, if your pals get killed, you don't really have a way of hearing about it.
Yeah, of course.
So she asks for another group of diplomatic envoys because she so enjoyed the company of the last ones. Right?
Yikes.
And if I recall correctly, they were burned alive. They were invited into a sauna or something similar, and the building was set on fire from the outside. Yeah. Typical.
So basically, Olga of Kiev is like the Saddam Hussein of the early Middle Ages in Russia.
Well, I mean, considering the early Middle Ages in general, she was pretty tame. She was really just taking revenge.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah. And also, she invited even more envoys because, you got a 3 to make a point.
Yep.
And she invites them to a great feast, gets them all really drunk, and they're having a time of their life. And then they're just slaughtered. Nothing special there. Just slaughtered.
Well, so I like how there's like 3 different envoys and 3 different ways to kill them.
Yeah.
So it's almost like she probably enjoyed this though.
It was a bit creative.
Yeah, it was pretty creative.
Now, this is going to be interesting later, considering that she was the first Christian ruler of Kiev.
Right. How very Christian of her.
Yeah, there's a trend with the Roos is that the more violent they were, the more Christian they were.
Right.
But I'm going to discuss this later. Now, the Drevlians are like, wow, I see very few envoys coming back from their trip to Kiev. And why is there this huge Roose army marching towards our city? So what do Roos do? They lay siege to the city, and the Drevlians, they're having a pretty bad time.
Yeah.
So Olga tells them, hey, I would like to have peace with you, but each household must give me, I believe, a sparrow and another bird. Yep. So each household gives them 2 birds from that live around their house.
Pigeons, maybe?
Probably a pigeon and a sparrow.
Yeah.
Not important for the story. Like, this is a story that's been done so many other places in history. We're pretty sure it's just a common story. But
yeah.
So she takes all these birds, puts them all together, and lights the birds on fire.
Okay.
Right? And what do birds do when they're on fire?
Well, I mean, they fly, probably.
And where does the bird fly?
To their nest.
To their nest. And where's the nest?
Probably under the wooden houses.
Yes, on the mostly wooden houses of the Drevlians.
Yeah.
So this way she basically burns down the entire Drevlian city.
Oh.
And I mean, this is a story. The same method has been used by so many conquerors in history. Like, I believe Kublai Khan, or no, Genghis Khan, sorry, used it also. So
yeah, it was also considered actually by the Americans during their fire bombings of Tokyo.
Yeah.
In fact, they wanted to attach napalm canisters to bats, and because the bats, they would then seek shelter under the mostly wooden houses of the Japanese.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, so this is probably either a common tactic or a recurring story in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Now, so at this point, the few Drevlians that were left hadn't been buried, killed, burned alive, whatever. They said, okay, we're not going to mess with you anymore. So they were effectively subjugated. So they probably enacted a whole lot more than double tribute at this point.
The Drevlians that were actually like left alive.
Yeah, the ones that were left alive.
Right.
So at this point, the Rus and the Slavs kind of started to respect Olga. Yep. I mean, you wouldn't imagine a woman to be so brutal back in those days. So she was considered to be one of the most prosperous rulers of Kiev. She was considered to be very wise, and under her reign, everyone had a good time.
Yeah.
Now, I told you before that Olga was the first Christian ruler of Kievan Rus.
Yep.
Now, the story behind this is quite interesting because, as most Rus rulers, she was traveling to Constantinople, like they did, and surprisingly without an army, which she was the first ruler who didn't travel there without the army.
Yeah.
So, and she sees all this fantastic architecture, this cathedral, these churches, and she's like, wow, this is really impressive. And so she gets an interest in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And the Basilius, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, according to Chronicle, had somewhat of a crush on her.
Okay.
Right? So, but she wants to exploit this because she wants to be Christianized and be respected and whatever. So she says, I would like to be baptized, but the Basilius himself must be the one to perform the baptism.
Okay.
Right? Now this is where it gets weird, because when you perform the baptism, you call the person being baptized your child or your son, or your daughter.
Yeah.
So after she's been baptized, the Basilius says, well, now that you're Christian, why don't we marry? Right? And she's like, are you telling me you just called me your daughter and you want us to marry?
Yeah.
And that's like the story of how she bamboozled the Basilius.
So she did this just to mess with him.
Well,
what's the point of this? I don't get it.
Well, it shows her strength, right?
Because
if she is able to say no to a marriage proposal from probably one of the strongest men in the world.
Right.
This guy commands one of the vastest, most military powerful empires, and she just says no. Like, that's a real show of force. It makes her look very strong.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. And it also means that she can be Christian because if you convert to the religion of your enemy, you are sort of showing that you're beneath them. You're giving them strength over you.
Yeah.
And this way, she's proving the opposite. She's saying, you're not in control, I am. I'm the one, etc.
Yeah.
Now, at this point, the year is about 945. I've been talking much about years, but Rurik's reign started in 862, and around 945, Sviatoslav comes to power. I do not recall what his Norse name was, but that isn't particularly important.
Yeah.
Now, before I'm going to talk about Sviatoslav, we are going to take a quick break, which will appear to be instantaneous for you, but will actually be a little while for us.
Yeah.
See you later. Welcome back. We have returned from our break, and now we will be continuing our discussion on Sviatoslav, the son of Olga and Igor.
Yeah.
Now he takes power around 945, and we've done this before a lot. What do you do when, and for once the answer is not raid Constantinople.
Okay.
What do you do when you're a Norse ruler and you just taken power and all the people before you were all very famous?
I mean, you have to make a name for yourself.
Yes, which you do by looting and pillaging.
Looting and pillaging, as always.
So, at this point, he's like, they're fighting a bit of a proxy war with the Byzantines, because the Byzantines don't really want them to go to Constantinople again. And the Byzantines have settlements in what today is Crimea, so yes, there has been conflict in Crimea since the beginning of time.
Yeah, and it continues to this day.
Yeah. So the Byzantines, they would support all these random Turkic nomads and tell them, hey, if you attack the Rus, we'll give you money. And sometimes they paid the Rus to help them attack the Bulgars, and we're all just a happy family trying to kill each other. So he does something that's pretty monumental for the history of the Kievan Rus. He conquers Khazaria. Now the Khazars were a group of Turkic Jewish nomads, which is very unique, who basically reigned in the area prior. Now, there was a small problem with conquering the Khazars, is that while they were weak and decadent, they kept the area stable, and they prevented other, more dangerous Turkic nomads from performing raids upon the Rus, particularly the Pechengs, which we are going to come back to later. Mm-hmm. So Sviatoslav, he's like, okay, I've just conquered the arch-nemesis of Rus, our biggest contender in the region. What do I do now? Well, he keeps conquering. So he conquers near the Caspian Sea, near the Black Sea, conquers down to Crimea. He particularly conquers in the west, because at this point in time, Byzantine Empire kind of declining.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been declining for a while, but more than usual. So the whole trade network sort of been moving west. So the Rus, who are reliant on trade, do what any smart raider, conqueror would do, and they start conquering in the west, the area which is today Galicia, Romania, Bulgaria, so many different countries today, Poland, Ukraine, maybe even Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. And he's like, wow, this area is pretty nice. He likes this area. And the Rus would continue to stick around this Galicia particularly for a long time. So he decides Kiev is boring, so he establishes a new capital called Pereslavets. Now, we don't really know where this city was. We presume it was somewhere around the border between Romania and Bulgaria, but it was basically a huge, how should I say, intimidating the Byzantines, because if you know your geography, that's pretty close to Constantinople.
Yeah.
And so it would be, challenging their trade monopoly in the area. So what do the Byzantines do? Well, they likely go to the Pechengs, a new rising group of Turkic nomads, and give them a whole bunch of gold and say, those Rus, we don't really like them. So the Pechengs, they decide to siege Kiev.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you see, this is a bit of a problem. So Sviatoslav, he's hanging around in Pereslavets, and his mother, Olga, and his children, and all of those, they're still hanging around in Kiev.
Yeah.
So, and he's probably got most of his army with him. So, Olga pleads with him, please send help, but he arrives too late. Thankfully, one of his boyars, which was Rus' name for noble, manages to somehow lift the siege of Kiev, but it was pretty devastated, and, Sviatoslav kind of showed to the people of Kiev that he didn't really care. He cared about what was in the west. Kiev was no longer as important as before. So, now, he's going to continue a bit of a trend. We know that he fought the Bulgars for the Byzantines. We know that he also, according to primary Chronicles, so take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
He probably also did a war with the Byzantines. Whether he sacked Constantinople, well, doesn't say in Byzantine sources, but he likely did a lot of stuff in Crimea. But we know that while he wasn't successful, he probably gathered quite a bit of loot. He was defeated, right? But he had all the plunder from all the plundering. So the Byzantines, probably out of spite, decided to pay the Pechengs to ambush him on his way home, around the year 972.
Right.
And what do you do when you've killed the ruler of the greatest nation in the area?
I would take advantage of the power vacuum.
And they also made his skull into a chalice.
They did what?
They made his skull into a chalice. Like, they drank from his skull.
Well, that's charming.
Yes. It's almost like the Middle Ages aren't a walk in the park.
Yeah, it's almost as if the Middle Ages are somewhat regressive from our current society.
Yes.
Who would have known?
Who would have guessed?
Who would have known?
Yeah. Now, there was a little bit of a problem, you see, when Sviatoslav died. Because he had 3 sons. And he decided to do what has been historically a very good idea.
Yeah.
And divide his princedom, or kingdom, between his 3 sons.
Yeah.
And, that's totally going to create a stable and functional society, right?
Yeah, by the way, this is sarcastic, just so you know.
Yeah. So...
Oh, geez.
So he has 2 sons, or 3 sons in total, who are now basically split up the Kievan Rus. He have Oleg, Yaropolk, and Vladimir.
Yep.
And they're obviously living together peacefully, being friends and prospered, and end of story.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No.
Never mind.
So, according to the primary chronicle, Sveneld, one of Sviatoslav's most important military commanders. You gotta remember, his sons are pretty young, don't really have any military experience. Their dad was like this great military hero.
Yeah.
So one of his commanders decides to manipulate Yaropolk into waging war on his brother Oleg in order to avenge the death of Sveneld's son, apparently by Oleg's order.
Okay.
So at this point, Oleg and Yaropolk are fighting each other. And Vladimir, he decides to go back to his roots. So he travels to Scandinavia.
Yep.
Because, he feels like things were getting a bit heated down in the Kievan Rus.
Yeah, he need to do some soul searching,
Yeah. So what do you do when you're a Viking descendant prince in Scandinavia and you want to take back your rightful kingdom that your brothers are fighting over?
We've been over this like 1,000 times.
We've been over this.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't plunder Scandinavia, if that was what you were thinking.
Yeah. Well, something similar.
Nothing similar. He gathered a great army of Scandinavians, of Vikings. This is before the end of the Viking Age, so Scandinavians are still considered some of the greatest warriors in the world.
Right.
So, and he decides, hey boys, we're going back to Russia. or to the Kievan Rus. So, in the war between Yaropolk and Oleg, Yaropolk sort of came out on top. Yeah. And he became ruler of Kiev. Sorry.
Constantinople.
I'm slightly confused.
Yeah.
So, Vladimir and his Varangians, they conquer what's left of Oleg.
Yeah.
And then they decide to lay siege to Kiev. But you see, the whole siege thing, not that easy. So, we went over this before, but what do you do when you're a Viking prince and you have a tough time defeating someone?
You put wheels on boats and.
Well, at this point, he didn't put wheels on his boats,
No.
but he did invite Yarapolk to peace negotiations and proceeded to stab him.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone loves a bit of fratricide now and then.
Yeah, of course.
At this point, you got Sviatoslav. He's sitting there in Kiev, and also he made his brother's wife into a concubine, as if stabbing him to death and taking his kingdom wasn't bad enough.
Yeah.
So that was the ultimate power move, and made him definitely come. Now, you're not gonna guess, but this is the guy who eventually Christianized the Kievan Rus.
Yeah.
So as I said previously, there's a bit of a trend with the more brutal they are, the more Christian they are.
Yeah.
I mean, completely unrelated. So at this point, a bunch of Viking warriors hang around in Kievan Rus, and a new strong ruler. So one can imagine that the Byzantines felt a little bit threatened.
Right.
A little bit.
Right.
But and this will be important later. Now, some funny things about Vladimir. Apparently, he liked women. And when I say liked, that's an understatement. He had a enormous passion for women, and he apparently had a harem of about 800 concubines total. That's in 2 cities he had 300, and in 1 city he had 200. Now, how the logistics of that work out?
Well, so they just stayed in the cities, and you just oh wow.
And he would just he would travel around the Kievan Rus, so they would just
How Christian of him.
How very Christian. And he also, if I recall, impregnated a nun, a Christian nun.
Again, very Christian.
Very Christian.
Very Christian.
Now, he's got a bit of a problem. You see,
right.
The religious authority of paganism is waning. Because, I mean, at this point, the Germanic pagans are starting to get beaten out of Europe or converting to Christianity. Slavic paganism is starting to subside in favor of Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox religion. So he does the unlogical steps, and he decides that he's going to reform the Slavic religion.
Right.
Now, reforming would make it have probably a concrete head of religion, because whereas, let's say Catholicism, you got the Pope, the clergy,
right,
all that, but Slavic paganism is really just some weird, vague beliefs.
Yeah, some like decentralized form of belief that did it have a religious authority even?
I don't even think they had a religious authority.
No, probably just some like the only authority they had is like the believer.
Yeah,
yeah.
And they probably had some seers as well, but but they weren't really taking that serious because they were speaking metaphors all the time.
Right.
So, but this didn't really work out, because it turns out when you got 1 trillion Slavic tribes, and you're a Norseman. Now, I didn't mention this, but as you can imagine, the Rus were originally Norse, right? Yeah. But at some point, we don't know when, well, we know that they converted to Slavic paganism. We know that in a Byzantine treaty, the Rus, they swore by Perun, the Slavic thunder god, to not break the treaty, which I feel like they did quite a lot.
Yeah, goes to show how swearing by a deity that potentially, probably doesn't exist.
Well, but not ruin their fun.
Yeah, but
so and we also know that in the primary chronicle, Vladimir specifically wants to reform the Slavic religion and not the Germanic one.
Right.
So that shows that that's the one he followed. But this failed because you probably have 1 trillion tribes or 1 trillion is by definitely an overstatement, but there are thousands of Slavic tribes.
Right.
Each of them believe differently. Probably some of them have contradictory beliefs, and most of them they don't care about the Rus. As long as they could just pay tribute and are left alone, they don't care.
Right.
Alright. So then he decides, I'm gonna have to choose religion. I'm gonna just take a religion, pick one, and say, this is the religion we follow now.
Right.
Now this leads to a very famous story, which is common in Russian culture.
Yeah.
So, first off, emissaries from whatever Arabian caliphate was going on at the time, they tell him, okay, you should convert to Islam.
Mm-hmm.
But they were like, well, we like eating pork, and we like alcohol quite a lot.
Yeah, right.
So Islam was a no-go.
Right.
Then you had Jewish emissaries, and they're like, okay, so you're the God's chosen people. Yes? And you follow the God's chosen belief. Yes? So why don't you control Jerusalem?
Right.
Like, doesn't that mean your God has abandoned you? So they didn't really want to convert to Judaism, and it sort of had a bit of a stigma because it was the religion of the Khazars who were their arch nemesis.
Right.
So that probably helped quite a lot.
Yeah.
Now, he had just recently conquered a settlement called Cherson, which is in Crimea, from the Byzantine Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, why don't I decide to go with Eastern Orthodoxy? Because they had seen the great cathedrals, the great works. I mean, if you're just a simple Norse Slavic tribesman traveling to Constantinople, it must be amazing.
Yeah.
Right? You couldn't even comprehend these enormous cathedrals like the Hagia Sophia, whatever, all this art, all these, like, it's almost out of this world for you.
Yeah. Because,
anything that you don't understand might as well be magic.
Yeah.
So what do you do? This is going to be a bit different from last time.
Okay.
What do you do when you're a Norse prince who says that, well, you're going to have to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy at some point, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't make you seem submissive to the Byzantine Empire?
You create an own church, or
No.
no?
So you go to war with the Byzantine Empire.
Okay, not like King Henry.
Yeah.
I was thinking like a Church of England or something.
So he just conquered this, and he said straight out to the Byzantine Emperor, "Give me the hand of your daughter." Yes, like, I will be baptized so that we can be married, but give me the hand of your daughter.
Or like literally.
Yeah.
Like,
he said no.
like sever the hand of your.
No.
No, because that's what I thought you meant.
Okay,
No.
I didn't mean the actual severed hand. I meant the hand in marriage.
Right. Okay,
Yeah.
thank God. Oh.
Okay. So this daughter is quite famous. Her name was Anna Porfirogenita. Okay, I don't know Greek. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that, but she is very important because she was the entire reason behind the Russian claim to be Third Rome, because they had a direct descendancy from the Byzantine emperors. And so there's a bit of back and forth probably between the Byzantine Empire and the Rus. And he's like, well, if I convert the Rus, the Byzantine Empire will have an enormous influence.
Right.
And it will basically stop making them a threat because good Christians don't attack each other. Right? Well, okay, let's not get into details here.
Yeah.
Now, so eventually he accepts, probably to the great dismay of his daughter, who apparently was sent off to marry some sort of barbarian.
Right.
And obviously this was the barbarian with 800 concubines, pregnated a nun, who would proceed to have quite a lot of wives after she would eventually die. But then she accepts.
Yeah.
We don't know why he accepted, but we presume maybe it was because he was busy elsewhere. He wanted to put down revolts. This we actually have some Arabian sources.
Yep.
And they tell us that at the time, the Basilius had a succession conflict going on, as happened about every month in the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah.
Because there's always someone wanting to be emperor.
Right.
And he desperately needed military help. So Arabian sources say that he gave the hand of his daughter in return for Rus military assistance against his enemies.
Okay.
But of course, it might be that he just wanted the Rus to convert, or it might be both. So Vladimir, he decides, well, if I'm going to convert to Christianity, we're going to make it splendid. So in Kiev, they have this enormous ceremony, which we have descriptions from Byzantine sources, we have archaeological evidence, we are very sure that this happened.
Yep.
Enormous ceremony when the entirety of the Rus, the entire Rurikid dynasty, converted.
Right.
Now, what do you think the Slavs thought about the rulers abandoning their religion and converting to the religion of their enemy?
I'd be pretty pissed.
Yeah. So we know there was quite a lot of unrest amongst the Slavs.
Right.
Because while the Rus were willing to accept Christianity because it gave them more power,
Yeah.
the Slavs were like, why? Why should we accept this?
Right.
So there was a lot of unrest, lots of revolts, and some Slavs, they said that they adopted Christianity Instead, they adopted a syncretic faith, a faith that takes elements from two different faiths, which was called Duervie.
Yeah.
Which basically meant that, probably from a Christian definition, they were heretics, but they still presumed to be Christian. And this has been a core part of the Russian identity today, this whole, well, we're Christian, but you still have all these superstitious elements that you can trace back to Slavic paganism.
Right.
Yeah. So there was this huge, grand ceremony, and everyone, all the Roos participated, and all was peaceful.
Okay.
Vladimir had married the daughter of the Basilius, Maradona. He became, his children became direct descendants. Now, at this point is where we would probably consider that the Norse part of the age of the Russian Vikings was over.
Yeah.
Because with Christianity, in the village, right? You're a rural Slav. Who has more influence over you? The priest in the church or the prince in the castle far away?
Probably the priest.
Right.
Yeah.
So the rulers, while they were Norse, by accepting Eastern Orthodox Christianity, a whole lot of Greek priests and Eastern Orthodox priests would be admitted in and sent to every single village far and wide.
Right.
So this is why in modern day you don't see any you don't see any Norse influences. You see some vague and far apart influences, but very few. But you see a lot of Greek influence.
Yeah.
And there was, during this time and slightly later, would be a huge culture conflict between the Norse and the Greek, which is the last remnants of Roricks lineage basically came up against this religious influx from the Greeks, which in the end, we're pretty sure the Greeks won. So with Vladimir's Christianization is when I would consider the age of the Russian Vikings to be over, and to be the main reason that we don't see that many traces of them today.
Right.
Now, this isn't entirely where Vladimir's story ends. He has a relatively peaceful rule. One of his sons decides to Yaroslav around 1014. Now, for any other people who know history, you'll know that this is about a little while before the Norman conquest of England and around the end of the Viking Age.
Right.
So it coincides also, which is why you wouldn't have any more Vikings coming to Russia, because they simply didn't really exist anymore.
Yeah.
And so his son decides, I want to be more powerful than old father. So he revolts against Vladimir, despite Vladimir probably being quite a chill. Well, we already decided that he was a pretty terrible person.
Yeah.
So he takes his army, goes after to crush Yaroslav's revolt, but he dies on the way because he's pretty old.
Right.
And after this, there's a huge civil war, which might be interesting to read about, which involved particularly Boris and Gleb, who were, I believe, the first saints of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Don't ask me. I'm not really an expert in this.
Yeah, it's not important. But if you're further interested in learning about the history after this, then this is where you would begin. But this is effectively, as I said, where the history of the Russian Vikings ends.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Did the Vikings play a defining role in Kiev on Rus?
Well, they almost have to.
Yeah.
As far as I'm by no means an expert, and I know almost nothing about this. But from what how I've understood it, at least, is that the Vikings play at least like some sort of role.
Yeah.
In obviously the settlers were Norse, and also you can bring in the question of Norse mythology into this and how that affected it.
Yeah.
And for example, if we see with the Slavic paganism, you have the god Perun, right, and then which is the main god, and he's also the god of thunder, and he is the god of thunder.
He's the god of thunder, yeah.
Yeah. But you also have Thor, which although he isn't like the god.
He's a very important one.
He's still nevertheless a very important one, and it's maybe interesting to draw parallels to this, and you even in Greek mythology, you have Zeus,
yeah,
which also is the god of thunder, and much like Perun, he holds a very high position there.
Yeah.
So
And I think just because the Rurikids, the sons of Rurik, ruled the Rus for so long, up until the time of trouble in the 15th century, right?
right,
The Rus, the Slavs, they still defined themselves. Like, I wouldn't agree with the super Normanist theories like the ones that the Nazis practiced,
right,
Because the Rus may have ruled, they may have built a legal code and structure, but the Slavs still define their own identity from their villages, from their stories, from their culture.
right on.
So I don't think saying that the Russian Vikings played an important role in the creation of Russia and the identity of the Slavs discounts the role of the Slavs.
Yeah. No, obviously, because you have almost like a dichotomy here.
Yeah.
Like between the Slavs and the Rus, and
This is interesting, and if you'd like to learn more about the history of the Russian Vikings, I recommend very much reading the Russian Primary Chronicle. It's available translated to English with the dates updated to our calendar on the internet if you just Google it. And then, of course, you can read a multitude of pages on the internet or check your local library to find reference to other sources which can confirm and deny parts of. And there are also all sorts of references to the land of the Rus or Gardariki in the Norse sagas. And yeah.
Yeah.
So we hope that you have enjoyed this episode of the Northern Saga.
yeah, this very first and maybe almost a pilot episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we welcome any and all feedback, and we recommend further researching the topic and finding out the parts where we were wrong using the links that we provide in the description.
Yeah, because we most probably were wrong.
Yeah.
One part of the podcast or another.
Yeah. As we've stated, we're no experts. We just want to ignite an interest in people and talk about something which we consider little known and interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks you for listening.
Yeah.
Have a great day.